Revolutions are ambiguous things. Their success is generally proportionate to their power of adaptation and to the reabsorption within them of what they rebel against. 1,000 reforms have left the world as corrupt as ever, for each successful reform has founded a new institution, and this institution has bred its new and congenial abuses. What is capable of truly purifying the world is not mere agitation of its elements, but their organization into a natural body that shall exude what redounds and absorb or regenerate what is lacking to the perfect expression of its soul. Whence fetch this seminal force and creative ideal? It must evidently lie already in the matter it is to organize. Otherwise, it would have no affinity to that matter, no power over it, and no ideality or value in respect to the existences whose standard and goal it was to be. There can be no goods antecedent to the natures they benefit, no ideals prior to the wills they define. A revolution must find its strength and legitimacy not in the reformer's conscience and dream, but in the temper of that society which he would transform. For no transformation is either permanent or desirable which does not forward the spontaneous life of the world, advancing those issues toward which it is already inwardly directed. How should a gospel bring glad tidings, save by announcing what was from the beginning native to the heart? No judgment could well be shallower, therefore, than that which condemns a great religion for not being faithful to that local and partial impulse which may first have launched it into the world. A great religion has something better to consider, the conscience and imagination of those it ministers to. The prophet who announced it first was a prophet only because he had a keener sense and clearer premonition than other men of their common necessities, and he loses his function and is a prophet no longer when the public need begins to outrun his intuitions. Could Hebraism spread over the Roman Empire and take the name of Christianity without adding anything to its native inspiration? Is it to be lamented that we are not all Jews? Yet, what makes the difference is not the teaching of Jesus, which is pure Hebraism reduced to its spiritual essence, but the worship of Christ, something perfectly Greek. Christianity would have remained a Jewish sect had it not been made at once speculative, universal, and ideal by the infusion of Greek thought, and at the same time plastic and devotional by the adoption of pagan habits. The incarnation of God in man and the divinization of man and God are pagan conceptions, expressions of pagan religious sentiment and philosophy. Yet what would Christianity be without them? It would have lost not only its theology, which might be spared, but its spiritual aspiration, its artistic affinities, and the secret of its metaphysical charity and joy. It would have remained unconscious, as the gospel is, that the hand or the mind of man can never construct anything. Among the Jews, there were no liberal interests for the ideal to express. They had only elementary human experience, the perpetual oriental brown of piety and servitude in the bosom of the scorched, exhausted country. A disillusioned eye, surveying such a world, could find nothing there to detain it. Religion, when wholly spiritual, could do nothing but succor the afflicted, understand and forgive the sinful, and pass through the sad pageant of life unspotted and resigned. Its pity for human ills would go hand in hand with the mystic plebeian insensibility to natural excellence. It would breathe with Tacitus, thinking of the liberal life, could call odium generis humani. It would be inimical to human genius. There were, we may say, two things in apostolic teaching which rendered it capable of converting the world. One was the latter, Jewish morality and mysticism, beautifully expressed in Christ's parables and maxims, and illustrated by his miracles, those cures and absolutions which he was ready to dispense, whatever their sins, to such as called upon his name. This democratic and untrammeled charity could powerfully appeal to an age disenchanted with the world, and especially to those lower classes which pagan polity had covered with scorn and condemned to hopeless misery. The other point of contact which early Christianity had with the public need was the theme it offered to contemplation, the philosophy of history which it introduced into the Western world, and the delicious, unfathomable mysteries into which it launched the fancy. Here, too, the figure of Christ was the center for all eyes. Its lowliness, its simplicity, its humanity were indeed, for a while, obstacles to its acceptance. They did not really lend themselves to the metaphysical interpretation which was required. Yet even the Greek fable was not without its Apollo tending flocks, and its Demeter mourning for her lost child and serving in meek disguise the child of another. Feeling was ripe for mythology loaded with pathos. The humble life, the homilies, the suffering of Jesus could be felt in all their incomparable beauty. All the more when the tenderness and tragedy of them, otherwise too poignant, were relieved by the story of his miraculous birth, his glorious resurrection, and his restored divinity. The gospel, thus grown acceptable to the pagan mind, was, however, but a grain of mustard seed, destined to branch and flower in its new soil in a miraculous manner. Not only was the Greek and the Roman to refresh himself under its shade, but birds of other climates were to build their nests, at least for a season, in its branches. Hebraism, when thus expanded and paganized, showed how many new characteristics native to the minds which had now adopted and transformed it. The Jews, for instance, like other Orientals, had a fugitive way of speaking and thinking. Their poetry and religion were full of the most violent metaphors. Now, to the classic mind, violent and improper metaphors were abhorrent, uniting, as it did, clear reason with lively fancy. It could not conceive one thing to be another, nor relish the figure of speech that so described it, hoping by that unthinkable phrase to suggest its affinities. But the classic mind could well conceive transformation, of which indeed nature is full, and in Greek fables anything might change its form, become something else, and display its plasticity, not by imperfectly being many things at once, but by being the perfection of many things in succession. While metaphor was thus unintelligible and confusing to the Greek, metamorphosis was perfectly familiar to him. Wherever Hebrew tradition, accordingly, used violent metaphors puzzling to the Greek Christian, he rationalized them by imagining a metamorphosis instead. Thus, for instance, the metaphors of the Last Supper, so harmless and vaguely satisfying to an Oriental audience, became the doctrine of transubstantiation, a doctrine where images are indeed lacking to illustrate the concepts, but where the concepts themselves are not confused. For that bread should become flesh, and wine blood, is not impossible, seeing that the chance occurs daily in digestion. What the assertion in this case contradicts is merely the evidence of sense. Thus, at many a turn in Christian tradition, a metaphysical mystery takes the place of a poetic figure, the former now expressing by a little miraculous drama the emotion which the latter expressed by a tentative phrase, and the emotion is thereby immensely clarified and strengthened. It is, in fact, for the first time really expressed. For the idea that Christ stands upon the altar and mingles still with our human flesh is an explicit assertion that his influence and love are perpetual, whereas the original parable revealed at most the wish and aspiration contrary to fact that they might have been so. By substituting embodiment for allegory, the Greek mind thus achieved something very congenial to its habits. It imagined the full an adequate expression, not in words, but in existences, of the emotion to be conveyed. The Eucharist is to the Last Supper what a centaur is to a horseman, or a tragedy to a song. Similarly, a Dante-esque conception of hell and paradise embodies in living detail the innocent apologue in the Gospel about a separation of the sheep from the goats. The result is a chimerical metaphysics containing much which, in reference to existing facts, is absurd. But that metaphysics, when taken for what it truly is, a new mythology, utters the subtler secrets of the new religion not less ingeniously and poetically than pagan mythology reflected the daily shifts in nature and in human life. Metaphysics became not only a substitute for allegory, but at the same time a background for history. Neoplatonism had enlarged, in a way suited to the speculative demands of the time, the cosmos, conceived by Greek science, an intelligible region unknown to cosmography, and peopled at first by the Platonic ideas and afterward by Aristotle's solitary God. There was now the absolute one, too exalted for any predicates, but manifesting its essence, in the first place, in its supreme intelligence, the second hypostasis of a Trinity, in the second place, in the soul of the world, the third hypostasis, already relative to natural existence. Now the Platonists conceived these entities to be permanent and immutable. The physical world itself had a meaning and an expressive value, like a statue, but no significant history. When the Jewish notion of creation and divine government of the world presented itself to the Greeks, they hastened to assimilate it to their familiar notions of imitation, expression, finality, and significance. And when the Christians spoke of Christ as the Son of God, who now sat at his right hand in the heavens, their Platonic disciples immediately thought of nous, or logos, the divine intelligence incarnate, as they had always believed, in the whole world, and yet truly the substance and essence of divinity. To say that this incarnation had taken place preeminently, or even exclusively, in Christ, was not an impossible concession to make to pious enthusiasm, at least if the philosophy involved in the old conception could be retained and embodied in the new orthodoxy. Sacred history could thus be interpreted as a temporal execution of eternal decrees, and the plan of salvation as an ideal necessity. Cosmic scope and metaphysical meaning were given to Hebrew tenets so unspeculative in their original intention, and it became possible, even for a Platonic philosopher, to declare himself a Christian. The eclectic Christian philosophy, thus engendered, constitutes one of the most complete, elaborate, and impressive products of the human mind. The ruins of more than one civilization and of more than one philosophy were ransacked to furnish materials for this heavenly Byzantium. It was a myth, circumstantial and sober enough in tone to pass for an account of facts, and yet loaded with enough miracle, poetry, and submerged wisdom to take the place of a moral philosophy and present what seemed at the time an adequate ideal to the heart. Many a mortal, in all subsequent ages, perplexed and abandoned in this ungovernable world, has set sail resolutely for that enchanted island, and found there a semblance of happiness. Its narrow limits give so much room for the soul, and its penitential soil breeds so many consolations. True, the brief time and narrow argument into which Christian imagination squeezes the world must seem to a speculative pantheist childish and poor, involving, as it does, a fatuous perversion of nature and history and a ridiculous emphasis laid on local events and partial interests. Yet just this violent reduction of things to a human stature, this half-innocent, half-arrogant assumption that what is important for man must control the whole universe, is what made Christian philosophy originally appealing, and which still arouses, in certain quarters, enthusiastic belief in its beneficence and finality. Nor should we wonder at this enduring illusion. Man is still in his childhood, for he cannot respect an ideal which is not imposed on him against his will, nor can he find satisfaction in a good created by his own action. He is afraid of a universe that leaves him alone. Freedom appalls him. He can apprehend in it nothing but tedium and desolation. So immature is he, and so barren does he think himself to be. He has to imagine what the angels would say, so that his own good impulses, which create those angels, may gain in authority, and none of the dangers that surround his poor life make the least impression upon him until he hears that there are hobgoblins hiding in the wood. His moral life, to take shape at all, must appear to him in fantastic symbols. The history of these symbols is therefore the history of his soul. There was in the beginning, so runs the Christian story, a great celestial king, wise and good, surrounded by a court of winged musicians and messengers. He had existed from all eternity, but had always intended, when the right moment should come, to create temporal beings, imperfect copies of himself in various degrees. These, of which man was the chief, began their career in the year 4004 BC, and they would live on an indefinite time, possibly. That chronological symmetry might not be violated until AD 4004. The opening and close of this drama were marked by two magnificent tableaux. In the first, in obedience to the word of God, sun, moon, and stars, the earth with all her plants and animals assumed their appropriate places, and nature sprang into being with all her laws. The first man was made out of clay by a special act of God, and the first woman was fashioned from one of his ribs, extracted while he lay in a deep sleep. They were placed in an orchard, where they often could see God, its owner, walking in the cool of the evening. He suffered them to range at will and eat of all the fruits he had planted, save that of one tree only. But they, incited by a devil, transgressed with a single prohibition, and were banished from that paradise with a curse upon their head. The man to live by the sweat of his brow, and the woman to bear children in labor. These children possessed from the moment of conception the inordinate natures which their parents had acquired. They were born to sin and to find disorder and death everywhere within and without them. At the same time, God, lest the work of his hands should wholly perish, promised to redeem, in his good season, some of Adam's children, and restore them to a natural life. This redemption was to come ultimately through a descendant of Eve, whose foot should bruise the head of the serpent, but it was to be prefigured by many partial and special redemptions. Thus, Noah was to be saved from the deluge, Lot from Sodom, Isaac from the sacrifice, Moses from Egypt, the captive Jews from Babylon, and all faithful souls from heathen forgetfulness and idolatry. For a certain tribe had been set apart from the beginning to keep alive the memory of God's judgments and promises, while the rest of mankind, abandoned to its natural depravity, sank deeper and deeper into crimes and vanities. The deluge that came to punish these evils did not avail to cure them. The world was renewed, and the earth rose again above the bosom of the waters. But in this renovation there remained eternally some trace of divine vengeance. Until the deluge, all nature had been exceedingly hardy and vigorous, but by that vast flood of water which God had spread out over the earth, and by its long abiding there, all saps were diluted. The air, charged with too dense and heavy a moisture, bred rancor principles of corruption. The early constitution of the universe was weakened, and human life, from stretching as it had formerly done to a near 1,000 years, grew gradually briefer. Herbs and roots lost their primitive potency, and stronger food had to be furnished to man by the flesh and other animals. Death gained upon life, and men felt themselves overtaken by a speedier chastisement. As day by day they sank deeper in their wickedness, it was but right that they should daily, as it were, stick faster in their woe. The very change in nourishment made manifest their decline and degradation, since as they became feebler, they became also more voracious and bloodthirsty. Henceforth, there were two spirits, two parties, or, as St. Augustine called them, two cities in the world. The city of Satan, whatever its artifices in art, war, or philosophy, was essentially corrupt and impious. Its joy was but a comic mask, and its beauty the whitening of a sepulchre. It stood condemned before God and before man's better conscience by its vanity, cruelty, and secret misery, by its ignorance of all that it truly behooved a man to know, who is destined to immortality. Lost, as it seemed, within this Babylon, or visible only in its obscure and forgotten purlieus, lived on at the same time the city of God, the society of all the souls God predestined to salvation, a city which, however humble and inconspicuous it might seem on earth, counted its myriad transfigured citizens in heaven, and had its destinies, like its foundations, in eternity. To this city of God belonged, in the first place, the patriarchs and the prophets, who, throughout their plaintive and ardent lives, were faithful to what echoes still remained of a primeval revelation, and waited patiently for the greater revelation to come. To the same city belonged the Magi, who followed a star till it halted over the stable in Bethlehem. Simon, who divined present salvation of Israel. John the Baptist, who bore witness to the same and made straight its path. And Peter, to whom not flesh and blood, but the Spirit of the Father in heaven, revealed the Lord's divinity. For salvation had indeed come with the fullness of time, not, as the carnal Jews had imagined it, in the form of an earthly restoration, but through the incarnation of the Son of God in the Virgin Mary, his death upon a cross, his descent into hell, and his resurrection at the third day, according to the Scriptures. To the same city belong finally all those who, believing in the reality and efficacy of Christ's mission, relied on his merits and followed his commandment of unearthly love. All history was henceforth essentially nothing but the conflict between these two cities, two moralities, one natural, the other supernatural, two philosophies, one rational, the other revealed, two beauties, one corporeal, the other spiritual, two glories, one temporal, the other eternal, two institutions, one the world, the other the church. These, whatever their momentary alliances or compromises, were radically opposed and fundamentally alien to one another. Their conflict was to fill the ages until, when wheat and tares had long flourished together and exhausted between them the earth for whose substance they struggled, the harvest should come, the terrible day of reckoning, when those who have believed the things of religion to be imaginary will behold with dismay the Lord visibly coming down through the clouds of heaven, the angels blowing their alarming trumpets, all generations of the dead rising from their graves, and judgment without appeal passed on every man, to the edification of the universal company and his own unspeakable joy or confusion. Whereupon the blessed would enter eternal bliss with God their Master, and the wicked everlasting torments with the devil whom they served. The drama of history was thus to close upon a second tableau, long robed and beautified cohorts passing above, amid various solemnities, into an infinite luminous space, while below the damned, howling, writhing, and half transformed into loathsome beasts, should be engulfed in a fiery furnace. The two cities, always opposite in essence, should thus be finally divided in existence, each bearing its natural fruits and manifesting its true nature. Let the reader fill out this outline for himself with 1,000 details. Let him remember the endless mysteries, arguments, martyrdoms, consecrations that carried out the sense and made vital the beauty of the whole. Let him pause before the phenomenon. He can ill afford, if he wishes to understand history or the human mind, to let the apparition float by unchallenged, without delivering up its secret. What shall we say of this Christian dream? Those who are still troubled by the fact that this dream is by many taken for a reality, and who are consequently obliged to defend themselves against it, as against some dangerous error in the science or in philosophy, may be allowed to marshal arguments in its disproof. Such, however, is not my intention. Do we marshal arguments against the miraculous birth of Buddha, or the story of Kronos devouring his children? We seek rather to honor the piety and to understand the poetry embodied in these fables. If it be said that those fables are believed by no one, I reply that those fables are or have been believed just as unhesitatingly as the Christian theology, and by men no less reasonable or learned than the persistent apologists of our own ancestral creeds. Matters of religion should never be matters of controversy. We neither argue with a lover about his taste, nor condemn him, if we are just, for knowing so human a passion. That he harbors it is no indication of a want of sanity on his part in other matters. But while we acquiesce in his satisfaction and are glad he has it, we need no arguments to dissuade us from sharing it. Each man may have his own loves, but the object in each case is different. And so it is, or should be, in religion. Before the rise of those strange and fraudulent Hebraic pretensions, there was no question among men about the national, personal, and poetic character of religious allegiance. It could never have been a duty to adopt a religion, not one's own, any more than a language, a coinage, or a costume not current in one's own country. The idea that religion contains a literal, not a symbolic, representation of truth and life is simply an impossible idea. Whoever entertains it has not come within the region of profitable philosophizing on that subject. His science is not wide enough to cover all existence. He has not discovered that there can be no moral allegiance except to the ideal. His certitude and his arguments are no more pertinent to the religious question than would be the insults, blows, and murders to which, if he could, he would appeal in the next instance. Philosophy may describe unreason as it may describe force. It cannot hope to refute them.